Hello everyone and welcome to... This is Europe, and here's Scotland. Now let's take a wee look, shall we? A land of lochs and firths, of highlands and islands, famed throughout the world for its stark, wild and rugged beauty. Initially inhabited during the sluggish thaw of the Ice Age, these hardy first settlers survived as hunters, and later on managed to design impressive stone domiciles, complete with drainage systems, as well as partake in that inexplicable ancient craze involving assembling large, upright standing stones for no one knows what reason. By the Iron Age, Celtic cultures had arisen across the British Isles, and Scotland's Celts proved exceptional builders. A prominent tribe of Celts within Scotland were called Caledonians by the Romans, and it is from Roman sources that we discover the first Scottish person whose name is known, Calgacus, a Caledonian chieftain who fought the invading Romans in the year 83. Rome triumphed, but were hard-pressed by the relentless Caledonian attacks, and withdrew their forces. Hadrian's Wall was built in what's now northern England, and marked the northernmost boundary of the Roman Empire. It's a stump of its former self, yet at over 100 kilometers long, it still testifies to how serious a threat the Romans considered the fierce, red-haired fighters to the north to be. But Rome still wanted to conquer it, and Septimius Severus launched a large invasion, but it went horribly, and according to Cassius Dio, over 50,000 Romans died before they again retreated. 2 centuries later, the Romans left Britain altogether. 2 Celtic groups now began to grow in significance, one domestic, one foreign. The former were the Picts, so called because they apparently painted themselves. Pictus means painted in Latin. We call them Picts, but don't know what they called themselves, and they'd probably complain that we could have picked a better name. The Picts were expert metalworkers. Just look at the craftsmanship of this chain, this brooch, this scabbard, or this Irish invasion. Wait, what? Yes, the Gaels of Ireland, also Celts, sailed over and began settling in the western region known as Argyll. Another name for the Gaels was the Scotti. Sound familiar? The Scottish influence and Gaelic language spread more and more, in no small part due to the energetic missionary work of men like St. Columba, whose preaching propagated the Christian faith. Militarily, there wasn't just conflict between the Picts and Gaels. The Anglo-Saxons had entered Britain after Rome's withdrawal, and they advanced up north with their kingdom of Northumbria. Then the Vikings invaded, taking control of the islands. In the midst of all this, a certain Gaelic king called Kenneth MacAlpin conquered the Picts and established a united Gaelic-Pictish kingdom. Not long after the death of King Macbeth, the Normans from France invaded Britain and conquered England. Norman ideas and ideals influenced David I, a builder and reformer who strengthened his realm and modelled his kingdom after that of feudal England. Now, Alexander III's children had an odd habit of dying, and thus his own death spurred a succession crisis. Scotland's appointed governors invited Edward I of England to intervene in the affair. Edward, called the Longshanks because he was very tall, had already conquered Wales, and was keen on getting Scotland too. Edward's overlordship was generally accepted, but was bitterly resented after he started demanding Scots fight for him against France. Instead of doing so, the Scots signed a treaty of alliance with the French in 1295. Edward, enraged, invaded Scotland and quickly conquered it. The proud Scottish people, however, quickly whipped up an armed resistance. The most famous resistor, of course, being William Wallace, who commanded the Scottish forces that defeated the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. In 1306, Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scotland, and he led his troops to a decisive victory against the English at the Battle of Bannockburn. Thereafter, Scotland's independence was recognised. But when this guy here claimed the Scottish throne, he was supported by Edward III of England. War happened again. The initial English victories preceded English conflict with France. The French, in trouble, begged Scotland to invade England and take the heat off. The Scots did so, and were beaten. Thankfully for Scotland, though, bad weather stalled the devastating English advance, and they withdrew. Big changes happened after the House of Stuart ascended the throne. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace was signed to stop the warfare betwixt Scotland and England. It didn't work, but it was a firm step in the correct direction. Scotland invaded England, but was defeated at the Battle of Flodden. England invaded Scotland, but were beaten by a joint Scottish-French force. Meanwhile, Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation was shaking up Europe, as numerous places were shuffling off the authority of the Pope and teachings and traditions of the Roman Catholic Church. Protestant ideas, particularly those of the French theologian John Calvin, spread rapidly in Scotland due to the efforts of men like John Knox. This religious shift precipitated the abdication of the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, who fled to England only to be imprisoned by her relative Elizabeth I, who feared feared her as a rival with claims to the throne, and later had her executed. While Mary may not have taken the throne of England, her son did. Elizabeth died without an heir, and thus in 1603, James VI of Scotland became James I of England. He must have been happy, as he began offering out knighthoods as if they were popcorn. He even knighted 48 people before breakfast, whilst on his way to London for the coronation. When the Catholic James II ascended the throne, a lot of English began freaking out, and Jimmy and his wig were kicked out. Thus began Jacobitism, the movement that sought to restore the House of Stuart to the throne. James was beaten at the Battle of the Boyne and fled to France, but the Jacobite cause was not snuffed out. Then, in the year 1707, the Parliaments of England and Scotland finally came to an agreement and sanctioned the union of their countries, thus birthing the United Kingdom. A good example of the slowly improving relations between England and Scotland can be seen in the figures of two writers, Englishman Samuel Johnson and Scotsman James Boswell. Johnson was jokingly not fond of Scotland. He once said to a Scot that the country was vile. The offended Scot replied that God had made it. Certainly, replied Johnson, but God also made hell. Nevertheless, Johnson became great friends with the Scot Boswell, who also became his biographer. The life of Johnson is regarded by many as the finest biography ever written. In 1715, the Jacobites rose again, but were unsuccessful in restoring the House of Stuart to the throne. They tried again in 1719, and one last time in 1745, this one led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, whose army and dreams were crushed at the Battle of Culloden. Meanwhile, the Scottish Enlightenment was producing enormously influential writers and philosophers, and what is even more impressive, Scottish innovators and inventors played a huge role in the British-born Industrial Revolution, which moulded the modern world, altering it forever. Altered also were the Scottish Highlands, which had long been the poorer, more backward segment of the country as a result of the Highland clearances, where tenant families were kicked out of their homes by their landlords to make way for sheep. Be it so, the proud, unyielding Highland spirit lingered on. In World War I, more than 500,000 Scots fought, and around 74,000 died. It was a Scotsman who commanded the British forces on the Western Front. Economic hard times struck Scotland for most of the 1920s and 30s. In World War II, Scotland was targeted by German attacks, and the country struggled in the decades afterwards too, as it shifted away from heavy industry to other economic sectors. In 1999, the long-defunct Scottish Parliament was revived. In 2014, Scotland held a referendum, in which the majority decided to remain within the UK. Will there be another? Probably. In 2016, the UK voted to leave the EU, which included Scotland, even though it had voted to remain. Anyway, Scotland today possesses a very high level of human development. The capital, Edinburgh, is one of the world's top financial centres, and the country is understandably a popular tourist destination, steeped as it is in character, culture, kilts and castles. A resilient nation that has withstood immense hardships and, despite all its troubles, has produced an inordinate amount of brilliance in fields such as literature and philosophy, science, sports, music and cinema, and throwing giant wooden poles. So that's it for Scotland, and that's all from me for now. Bye-bye!